Welcome to our panel discussion entitled IoT, Today and Tomorrow.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's our pleasure to be here. My name is Steve Flammini. I'm the Chief Technology Officer with Partners Healthcare, an integrated delivery network here in the Boston area in eastern Massachusetts. Our panel today has got great insights into IoT and healthcare, and we're going to touch on a number of topics related to that. I'd first like to introduce Tad Reynes. He's a Global Director of IoT Solutions with AT&T. Sally Frank is a healthcare IoT advisor with Microsoft, and Gilles Lunzenfichter is the Chief Commercial Officer with Medisanté. I thought I'd start by first turning it over to each panelist to give a brief overview of their role and what their organization's goals and efforts are in this space. Tad?
Sure. Thank you, Steve. So as Steve said, Tad Reynes, I run the healthcare practice for AT&T in the IoT space. So my team works with a lot of cardiac monitoring companies, remote patient monitoring, CPAP machines, things of that nature. So we work on providing the back-end connectivity for the devices, as well as hardware and software solutions for them, consulting, anything around certification, anything our customers need to transmit their data wirelessly. We end up getting involved in those projects. So happy to be here today.
Great, thanks. Sally?
Thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. So my name is Sally Frank. I'm with Microsoft. I'm part of a team called the Global Black Belt Teams. It's a team of specialists. And my area of specialty is IoT. And so I work with many of our partners and our customers to bring IoT solutions into their organizations to improve efficiencies, to improve outcomes, and really help them integrate into their existing platforms using our IoT tools, as well as many of the AI tools that people have been talking about as well, because as we all know, just connecting doesn't really do anything. We have to actually do something with the data. So that's how I spend my day.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sally. Gilles?
So I'm Gilles, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer from Medisanté. Which means that I try to convince the world that there is a time for a new generation of medical IoT infrastructure that is much easier to integrate into clinical system than is the case today, and that this possibility relies on a direct-to-cloud connectivity. And I'm very pleased to be here and exchange within the panel and also with people in the audience, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, everyone. One issue we'd like to start with is that of adoption and barriers to adoption or accelerants for adoption. If you look across multiple industries, I think of the aircraft manufacturing industry where we've got sufficient telemetry in the IoT space where there are now digital twins of aircraft engines running back at the manufacturer that are being monitored all the time for maintenance. Same with the automotive industry, increasingly a lot of telemetry coming back, of course autonomous vehicles and everything related to that. Municipalities, utilities, power grid, these are all examples of industries where the adoption of IoT seems palpable. But would you say it's more of a mixed bag in healthcare? And if so, what do you see as the barriers and how can we get past them? Would you like to take it first, Gilles?
Yes, so I think, for instance, a major difference between automotive and healthcare is that in automotive you have maybe 10 or 20 providers of automotive. While in healthcare, you probably have tens of thousands in the world. So this gives a huge difference in terms of privacy rules, that you put around this connectivity of IoT data back to whoever needs to act on them to do something meaningful. And I think the second difference is indeed that automotive, the car, the vendor who built the car needs the data. But in healthcare, it's a doctor, and it's a bit a different story. There is not a single manufacturer of the human being. And we really believe that today providing the data from very good sensor technologies that are available today on the human body, this way back to the person who needs it, which is in a care team, a healthcare professional, a nurse, is way more difficult for technology reasons and for security reasons in an industry like healthcare. And the fact that today the approach relies on a Bluetooth connectivity where you leave two pieces of hardware in the home, deal together, and then send back the data to a doctor in one of the 10,000 systems. There's so much complexity in this setup that, we're at the beginning of a new journey, I believe, where IoT will add more value to the physician.
Thank you, Sally.
Yes, so in my role, I have the opportunity to work with both the healthcare manufacturers on the payer, as well as the payers and providers. So I really see kind of a bifurcation of IoT. And in the pharma and life sciences and med devices side, we really see an embracing of IoT from a manufacturing supply chain and those types of applications. But when we get to the payer and provider side, which is where the impact can really affect patient outcomes, that's where we're struggling a little bit.
Yes.
And so there are a multitude of complications, some of which you mentioned. But I think it's incumbent upon us as providers of the technology to start overcoming some of those things, start looking at security differently, at patient data differently. And so we do have a few initiatives that we're working on at Microsoft. One, and these are not plugs, these are going to be open source types of things, but one is a solution accelerator for patient health, for remote patient monitoring, so that this code set becomes available to anybody who wants to do that. So it's a way to accelerate the process. We've also added things like Azure Sphere, which is a software that sits on an MCU that provides an added layer of security. So there's, and I could go on, there are a couple of others, but the idea here is that we have gaps if we're going to move forward, and it is our responsibility as technology companies to fill those gaps to make it possible.
Thank you. Ted?
Yeah, I'd say one element that certainly resonates is that, historically speaking, industries like the automotive industry have traditionally plowed about 10% of their revenues back into IT. Healthcare, by contrast, historically has plowed about 4% into IT. Technology has just been underfunded from a healthcare standpoint. That's starting to change over the last few years, but it's just been slow to adopt technology that other industries were quick to adopt and pursue. And so there's just this huge learning curve that healthcare is catching up with and trying to make use of technology that other industries have used for years. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we have a customer that has got a demo booth out there, Vivify. We've worked with them since the very origination of their company. And we saw them work with providers where they were very successful in pilots, but they would have a hard time doing larger contracts at the outset only because there wasn't reimbursement. And now that there's reimbursement, it's amazing how when people get paid, technology magically gets adopted, right? And so unfortunately, in our system, the incentives have to align. And until that happens, you just don't get the uptick in technology that in theory should take place.
I think there's another point that's worth mentioning. We talk a lot about bias in AI models. But I also think as we look to the market and how we want to implement these technologies, there's some inherent biases that we have. So we tend to think of an elderly person not being very tech savvy. And so what are we not offering because we think, no, it's not appropriate for them. Then we look at, millennials and we think, well, they're digitally native, so they'll embrace all of it, when in fact they're, studies have shown they're a little bit standoffish. And then we have the additional desire to overcome things like people getting a Fitbit and 3 months later they're not interested anymore and they stop wearing it. So there are cultural shifts and biases that we also have to overcome in addition to the things that technology will enable.
Yeah, just one to point to Sally's. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I love the advent of the retail clinics. There's nothing that frustrates me more than going to a doctor's appointment, waiting in a waiting room for an hour. It just my time being valued less than other people's as a consumer just makes me crazy. And seemingly my kids, I've got a 15-year-old and an 18-year-old, would absolutely be on board with this. But whenever I go to a clinic, my daughter, my 18-year-old, will turn to me and say, Dad, when are you going to go to a real doctor? And I'm like, real doctor? What makes them any less real? But she sees that system as being fake, and I assume that her, being an 18-year-old would be quicker to adopt that than me being in my 40s. So you're absolutely right. The heuristics that you assume to be true are not always the case.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, Gilles. Go ahead.
Yes. I think that for adoption, making it simple for all the parties involved is always a good design principle. And I think that today there has been an overemphasis on simplicity for the consumer, but often the consumer we talk about is not ill. So as there is no economic impact, with it. It's interesting. It helped the industry to be where it is. It helped to demonstrate that the sensors have a huge value. They work. There is no doubt that the sensor technology works. But I think that we forgot to make sure that it's also simple, especially in a remote patient monitoring setup, for two other stakeholders who are the medical doctor or the healthcare professional at large and the biomedical engineer. Because we talk here about infrastructure, distributing for a provider 10,000 weigh scales, 20,000 blood pressure monitor, and 50,000 blood glucose monitors someday in some not so distant future will require the involvement of somebody who takes care of managing that infrastructure. And I think this is the major difference between a consumer approach of devices that are Bluetooth-based that are meant for self-measurement versus an approach which is provider-led, where biomedical engineers and physicians should have a key word to say what they really need to make it simple. And here, it's a completely different approach. And I think we underserve the real needs of simplicity of the physicians and the biomed engineers and overserved the consumer who are not ill.
Sure.
Let's jump forward to that theme, which is that there could be a misalignment between what a patient wants out of these capabilities versus what a clinician may want or not want. In the example of a torrent of data coming off of sensors that they may not be very interested in, they may be concerned about its provenance and its relevancy, versus what a healthcare organization itself may want, and if those things aren't aligned. Could you say a bit about each of your organizations, observations on how to sort of normalize across consumer expectations versus those of clinicians or healthcare organizations or payers, for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think we end up spending a lot of time very close to the consumer. A lot of the devices that we enable wirelessly are used by the consumer. And so, I think we're certainly on the cutting edge of seeing that side of it. Where we see some of the challenges back to the provider is, for example, how much data gets back to the provider and what's relevant. I think that, we've gotten feedback that providers, they don't, the torrent of data that you referenced, right? I mean, there's a liability involved with getting too much data and not being able to sort through it. There are only so many hours in the day, so if the data isn't normalized and you don't have appropriate markers to, guide you towards information that requires attention, then there can be so much noise that it is not worthwhile deploying the technology. So the doctors that I've worked with in the past would always say something that along the lines of, there's never a time where I don't want to provide optimal care to a patient, and the time where my ability to care for them is forsaken is when they're not in front of me. And so being able to get access to data is a great thing, but making sure that data is relevant and does not waste my time is of paramount importance.
Well, and to build on that, I think one of the things that we are accustomed to is a one-to-one between a biometric and an alert. And so with all of this technology, and the ability to share the data in a meaningful way, we have this ability to get out of that mind frame and really focus on using models that take multiple biometrics, whether it's for one chronic condition or multiple chronic conditions, and really evaluate them in near real time and do something appropriate. I think the other thing that is somewhat confusing for a consumer versus a provider is that we have consumer-grade devices and we have medical-grade devices that both do monitoring. And there's confusion from a consumer perspective as to which is which, and I suspect that at some point there'll be a lot of devices that fall into that gray area. And so how do we convey in a way that says, yes, an Apple Watch might be able to do kind of that first line thing, but no one is going to diagnose on a reading from an Apple Watch. So what does the process look like that says this biometric or this group of biometrics from a consumer grade device is meaningful enough that it needs to be elevated to a medical professional? And I think we're still trying to figure that out.
Yes, the question of what data should reach the physician, that's the fundamental question. And I trust the physicians that if they say what they want and we put in place the right process and technology to listen what they want, then we can achieve it. I think right now we're in a process where in fact it's 99% driven by consumers, and the doctors are like, ooh, because you have if you take a GP who has 4,000 patients in his database, imagine 1,000 are chronic, and you have 1,000 who come with 500 different devices and 500 different mobile apps out of the 380,000 that exist. You know, that's the only reaction of the physician, you know, he doesn't want. So I think there needs to be a change in who is driving what and who wants what. And the industry of the physicians as a trade needs to be clearer about what they want and what they need. Otherwise, they just get overwhelmed by things they don't know what to do out of it. And I think a good way to achieve this is to put the physician in the driver's seat of remote patient monitoring, where he decides who he monitors. He decides what data he wants. He decides how he wants it, and then he just needs a technology that allows him to get what he needs from a medical perspective. So I think this change of mentality that the physicians should be more vocal about their real needs would help to get what they want. If they don't say it, they will never get it. Yep. They will be overruled by the consumer. Yep. And indeed, this is noise.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's true.
I want to shift to security. For many in the audience, you know, it feels like we're in an arms race where we are making huge investments, you know, doing a lot of diligence, but the bad guys are beginning to use machine learning. And it's going beyond them being just clever now. They are actually morphing their threats. And so the arms race continues, and we're very concerned about it. If you look at the wonderful promise of IoT in healthcare, and if you look at some of these capabilities such as edge computing, where you can actually deliver code in a container to an IoT device and drive a lot of sophistication and a lot of security, as you were making reference to, Sally, and you may want to elaborate on it a little bit. We still have this dilemma where there's a lot of surface area out there now. It's not just you know, protecting assets within the four walls of an organization or just within public and private clouds. Now you've got all of this surface area of devices and software running and generating all of this data. It's a major concern. I think organizations that take a risk-based approach to this can realize value and not be paralyzed by it. But I'd like each panelist to give their thoughts on the how you're thinking about security in each of your organizations and you know, your your approach to it.
Wait, do you want to start?
Should I start?
Go ahead.
Yes, so maybe I just cover 2 points. The first point, we really take at Medisanté a provider perspective of IoT. So it's about having a provider deploy one day tens of thousands of multiple devices and managing them, reducing cost of readmissions and achieving better outcomes with patients that are remote. So in this context, which is totally different from just a self-monitoring of patients in terms of prevention, I would say that there are 2 things that I want to highlight in this panel. The first thing is I believe that the identity of the patient should never end up in the hands of a device vendor. It should never go in the cloud of the proprietary cloud of this device vendor. So this is a first way to reduce security risk, because if you keep the identity within a clinical system that is in the US HIPAA compliant or in other countries obeys to different regulations, the security risk around leakages about sensitive data that relate to this patient is limited, and we hope that all the security existing in clinical system will help reduce the security risk of deploying those IoT devices. Then the second point is more a technology point. I was in a security lab recently from a vendor who was explaining how beautiful his security capabilities are. And they took a device connecting via Bluetooth with another piece of hardware, and they demonstrated how basically they could crack it. Just the reality is that the endpoint, having in the endpoint of the home of maybe someday millions of patients, Bluetooth connectivity as the foundation in the last mile of collecting data back, this is a design mistake. The only way to secure this is to have a direct-to-cloud connectivity with a cellular type of encryption. So we cooperate with Gemalto, which is a subsidiary of Thales. So basically, Thales, they would take care of military security type of issues. And I think we have an opportunity to apply similar kind of security paradigm in the military area to the healthcare area. But this will mean that there is no place ultimately in a remote patient monitoring setup for Bluetooth devices. And this requires a huge shift in the medtech industry, that they need to think about multiple areas of connectivity to send back the data, and that cellular or direct to cloud will need to play a major role in the future. And this will take probably 2 or 3 years because hardware is involved, firmware is involved, and so there is a time gap until this vision of more cellular and less Bluetooth can become reality.
Interesting and a little provocative.
I think I have a new chief security officer with me on all of my sales engagements. That's you couldn't have paraphrased the security pitch that we give as to why the cellular-enabled device is any better than you did. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that there are a number of devices that we enable that are transmitting data via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi today. And there are a number of advantages that we'll talk about that our customers have used to move to cellular-based transport, not the least of which is kind of the out-of-box experience and not having to do any pairing that will increase patient adherence tremendously relative to what they've been using to that point. But oftentimes they'll focus on the patient experience, which is paramount, and not even consider the security aspect. And I think oftentimes take for granted that the security that they have over Bluetooth is plenty good, and they don't have anything to be concerned with. And so sometimes in our engagements, security will be a large part of the conversation, and it strikes the customer slightly sideways because it wasn't what they thought they'd be talking about at the head end of the conversation. And it's almost, strange to say, a fringe benefit of migrating from the technology that was transporting their data previously to having a cellular-enabled transport mechanism moving forward. So just kind of interesting. I appreciate the pitch. I wasn't expecting it.
So from the Microsoft perspective and looking at how we do IoT, there are really two major components to how we approach security. And one involves what we call our IoT hub, which is our ingestion engine. So you connect a device to the cloud through this hub, and it provides security, bidirectional communication, and allows you to scale and send updates either to a complete class of device, which could be thousands or hundreds of thousands of devices, down to one device. So it gives you that ability to scale as well as having security built in. But that was not good enough because we did more. And I mentioned earlier our Azure Sphere. And so without getting too technical, the Azure Sphere is a software that sits on an MCU. So every Apple Watch, every smartphone, every connected device has an MCU, microcontroller unit. This software has three components. It has the operating system, the software application, and then security. And that security takes the form of keys and major encryption and things that go above and beyond what you would typically consider in a connected device. And so it does things like automatic detection of threats and then responding to those threats automatically and then reporting on them. So it's not perfect yet, but we are making strides to provide software that is easily integratable into either existing devices or can be retrofitted into brownfield environments through dongles and things. We did this with Starbucks. As a matter of fact, we retrofit their, I know it's not healthcare, but we retrofitted their coffee makers so that they were secure and connecting to the cloud. So there are ways to do it, and we're improving upon it all the time.
Maybe if I just comment, I like the Starbucks, but the problem is coffee machine is pretty different from patients.
Absolutely.
And again, to my analogy with the automotive industry, you have one Starbucks who wants to collect all the data of all his coffee machine in all his shops, while in the healthcare industry, you have 10,000 providers who want to collect whatever, but it's a completely different, it's not one guy, a utility company or a coffee machine company that wants to collect. It's a distributed set of providers, a very long tail of providers that want to collect the data that are meaningful. And but I totally agree with you, Sally. The cloud will play a key role in the future because it's the only way to make it elastically scalable. Because you're right, whether you have one coffee machine or one device, doesn't make a difference to the cloud to transmit data via a hub. And so we also decided, after simplifying the connectivity by embedding cellular in the device, to leverage the scalability of the cloud. So we have chosen AWS in our case, but in general, the cloud brings similar capabilities to scale. And what is important is that we made a choice that those global technologies, both the cellular capabilities and the cloud capabilities, only deal and transmit anonymous device data, which means that we have a philosophy that the identity of the patient and the mapping to a device identifier always needs to happen in a clinical system. And then the global technologies can be used, to put 5 million devices going through one cloud, going back to 10,000 clinical systems. So just wanted to say that I totally agree with the power and the potential of the cloud, but we also need to pay attention that healthcare, it's not one vendor who has a single device and captures all the data.
Yeah, and so just to kind of follow up on that, our thinking is when it comes to healthcare is that the med device companies would take ownership and want to integrate something like Sphere into their products. So it's not, again, we're not looking at providers per se, but we're looking at what devices the providers are using to give them that connection and that security. So yeah, we totally agree.
Well, we're now clearly crossing over into that theme of interoperability and ways in which standards could help drive better security, better adoption. If you look at, healthcare and the emergence of the FHIR standards as one example, this enables patients to direct data out of their EHRs to other EHRs or to other application providers, even into IoT scenarios possibly. Could you each give your impressions of where interoperability is going? How do we get to true ecosystems as opposed to kind of balkanized platforms that don't interoperate very well, which is part of the last couple decades worth of efforts in home monitoring and so forth. There are specific gateways and specific implementations, but not necessarily an ecosystem. Could you talk about your vision for that?
Yeah, I think what we see from our device manufacturers is it's both from the provider and the consumer side. I think for the providers, the EHR is always going to be kind of the single patient record. And so more and more we'll have customers come to us and talk about kind of the building blocks of what we provide from a connectivity and solution standpoint. But we do have more now coming to us and asking if we can help them integrate into EHRs, which hasn't necessarily traditionally been AT&T's space, but it is more and more now, and we won't necessarily do that ourselves, but we have a lot of partners that we work with that do so, and I think they recognize that for it to be clinically valuable, you have to get the relevant data into the EHR so there's a single patient record. I think for the consumer it's still very bifurcated, but I think it's interesting. You've got companies like Under Armour buying a lot of fitness apps, right, and trying to gain scale by getting a lot of the apps and consolidating all that information such that you're going to buy more Under Armour gear, right? And I think there's going to be more of that happens now. We at AT&T, a lot of the benefits that they're providing discounts with are using a single app and consolidating all of your health and fitness information into that and then getting rewards for it, and I think that's going to be more of what happens, that insurance, whether it be payers or self-insured people like AT&T, how do you give incentives back and have a single, consumer repository for all that data, and then reward them for acting the way they should. So I think more of that's going to continue to occur.
Yeah, I think when we think about interoperability, one of the things that we have going on at Microsoft, actually from our research team, is building what we're calling a healthcare data platform that is going to kind of span the chasm from these devices through, ingesting the information, organizing it, using the FHIR API to get to the EMR. And because it's software, that's what we do. And the goal is to make this available in a way much like a solution accelerator, where it's kind of open source and you get the opportunity to integrate it into your solution that you're building, and it becomes a standard connector or a standard way to connect and bridge that gap. We also are looking at a couple of other things from an interoperability standpoint, and this kind of spans beyond healthcare, but we have a new initiative. It's called IoT Plug and Play, and it's really designed to help people understand what connection information is needed to essentially make every device, medical or other, a USB drive, and you plug it in and it works and it's recognized because of what's been programmed into that particular device. So that's just been released, and we haven't really hit the healthcare market there yet, but these are the types of things that we're working on, because interoperability, while I think it's acute, no pun intended, as far as the level of requirements that we have in healthcare, which is different than, say, manufacturing, it is a problem that exists beyond healthcare. So there are things that we're doing that will be directly applicable to many industries, and then some that will focus on just those unique requirements of the healthcare industry.
Yes, so I represent Medisanté in a new initiative, and if in the audience there are people who are interested in contributing, they are welcome. It's an initiative from HIMSS that asks two of the daughters, which are PCHA, and also IHE to join forces to better address interoperability topics in the context of device connectivity. Because so far, interoperability, mainly driven by the IHE daughter of HIMSS, was mainly about data interoperability. How can EHR exchange data, reconcile patients that have similar names, but you're not too sure, things like that. And while PCHA was more in the device connectivity to fitness system mainly, but also clinical system. And now there was a press release yesterday about having the two groups under the umbrella of HIMSS join forces to better address these interoperability topics, specifically with devices. And our perspective is that interoperability, the best way to achieve interoperability is to avoid the problem. So the best way is to assign a device in a clinical system, so it's immediately interoperable with the system. If you start with another approach where you start with a device pairing in the home that sends the data of the patient, including his identity, to the cloud of a device vendor, and then you have like 300 device vendor, and then you try to extract this data from the cloud of the device vendors to 10,000. I mean, this is like Mikado, you know, it has a certain level of complexity. So I think conceptually, by design, we believe that reducing interoperability issues with devices, the best is not to go through the cloud of a device vendor, because it's the worst you can do to solve the interoperability problem. It's basically to keep the identity of the patient in the clinical system, distribute the devices, make a cellular connectivity into it, so you have solved 100% of the device interoperability problems, and you have stopped the silos of the device vendors being an obstacle to interoperability. So I'm aware it's a bit provocative, so I think the reality will go towards this, but 99% of the reality today is an interoperability problem caused by the device silos and the cloud silos attached to the device vendors.
All right, well, it's crystal ball time. If I had to ask each of you to put on your futurist hat and tell us 5 years from now, what is the most fundamental advancement in unlocking this, what has been estimated to be a $25 billion in North America alone, potentially $25 billion market. What's the one most significant breakthrough or obstacle you see being overcome 5 years from now, Ted?
You know, I guess for me, I don't know that there's going to be any technology shift that happens over 5 years, but I think that the shift to outcomes-based care is going to be so prevalent relative to where it is today that it will continue to demand the use of technology. You know, it would frustrate me. I was talking to a friend of mine earlier today about the fact that, you know, again, remote patient monitoring just gets reimbursement codes this year. It's been around seemingly forever. It's amazing it's taken this long. And what I always find to be frustrating about the, you know, type of care that we have in the United States is that even though you can optimally take care of patients with better technology in their home, with better outcomes, fewer readmissions, that kind of care won't be put forward until you have reimbursement models that support it, right? And so yeah, I think people have talked about outcomes-based care for a long time. I think people mean to get there, but until you have all of the underpinnings in place to allow that to take place, the change still happens very slowly. There's still you know, a lot of procedures that are paid for every day in the United States today. And it feels to me that as long as that happens, it restricts the adoption of technology because it's based on old paradigms of care that require old methodologies and serve pretty much as barriers to technology. So it feels to me that as that happens, more and more technology is going to be adopted because it's going to be in every provider's best interest to do so. And that's what's going to be exciting because it will enable cost to continue to decrease and patients to be taken care of better in the process.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think kind of building on what Tad was saying is that I think that there's two things that I would add to that. One is the advent of kind of the retail establishment that you were talking about. And I think that's going to have a significant, I think there are many people that believe that will have a significant impact on how healthcare is delivered. And if I were to, put my crystal ball in and put on my rose-colored glasses too, I would say that because of that, because of the technology, because of the awareness that we're building around chronic care, chronic conditions, as well as those things that lead to those, and the ability to do some self-monitoring about our activities and about our basic health rates and things like that. I'm hoping that this will all get to a point where we're now starting to really focus on what Dr. Kveter talks about, expanding the lifespan, and really beginning to see it won't happen in 5 years, but beginning to see the fruits of that labor.
Yep.
And realizing that, yes, going in and getting a flu shot so you don't get sick, and being able to have virtual visits. I myself had kind of an accident, and everyone kept saying you need to go to the doctor, and I did a virtual visit with Teladoc because I didn't want to go, and they were like, yeah, you need to go to the ER, so I went. But it was just really kind of interesting that those types of things are all coming together in a way that the care continuum gets broadened from an experiential perspective, but also from what we're treating and what we're evaluating and what we're looking at, so that we are treating wellness and focusing on that as a precursor to, illnesses as well.
Yeah, just to add on to Sally's point, I'm sure you guys have all seen that, CVS is, they have 2,000 locations that they're going to expand their clinics into larger health hubs, right? Because clearly they see the benefit in what they've done so far, and they see the possibility.
Best Buy too.
Right, exactly. Best Buy, we all know about the Amazon partnership right now. There's more and more Walmart that the people see that they can transform healthcare and attack it from a retail-based standpoint. One thing that I found to be especially interesting, my wife has been a nurse, and then we had kids, and she stepped away to take care of the kids, and now she's going into hospice care. And to be a hospice nurse, you have to go through a barrage of TB tests to make sure that you don't carry TB into that setting. And what I found to be so interesting was she went into CVS to get the TB test and the results, and the CVS nurse actually walked her through what the cost of that TB test would have been if she had gotten it in the hospital, and what the turnaround time would have been for it to be read in the hospital relative to the CVS. And so what I found to be so interesting about that is that the CVS clinic is not only providing quick care, but also educating consumers on, had you gone a different route, here's what the outcome would have been. And I think that's really going to step up competition and make consumers that much more aware of what alternatives are and what they'll cost and time and money.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that in healthcare, there will be more and more evidence that will be captured in many countries in the world, and usually it takes time to capture this evidence. But I just give you one example. In France, there was a cardiologist in one university hospital. He got innovation subsidies to try to invent the future. And so he built with a solution provider, who is a company called BeWise in France. They focused on remote patient monitoring of heart insufficient patients. And by monitoring 5,000 patients, 1,000 every year, they could figure out that in terms of evidence, they reduced by 46% the mortality after the discharge of the hospital. And they could reduce by 34% the readmission rate. So these numbers were so huge that the pilot, in one region, in one hospital, suddenly got a lot of attention, and there was an escalation, a high visibility at the national level, so in one country, France. And this led to the reimbursement of remote patient monitoring for heart insufficient patients on a much bigger scale. And as in the US right now, where the CPT codes have been introduced. I think that changes of policies top down with decision maker, politicians who are well advised, who make the right change of policies, will take away one of the basic obstacles to adoption of meaningful technologies. If the doctors are not paid for a virtual type of care, needless to say, they will never do it because they need to pay their bills at the end of the month. And so I think it's a mixture of having the right policies with visionary leaders who go for it. And I must say I was impressed by what happened in the US with the introduction of those new codes in 2019, really impressed. And on the other hand, I think people on the ground need relentlessly to continue to collect evidence, to make the case, because without evidence, the healthcare system will not change.
Yeah, if I could add another point is, I think we also have an opportunity, and hopefully this will be really impacted in the next 5 years, is the inequity in healthcare. And when I think about some of the work that's being done to connect people to the internet who are not connected in this country and across the globe, when I think about a solution that was highlighted at one of our conferences recently with a doctor in a box, basically he's got a backpack that does all the vitals. When I think about another solution that I'm aware of, it is a mobile x-ray machine, goes on your back, that they bring to miners to understand if they're at risk, and when they're at risk for black lung and other mining-related illnesses. So when we think about the 5-year plan and what it looks like, we have the building blocks now to really close that gap between those that need healthcare and are not getting it, and the fact that we can provide it in a way that is scalable for them within the confines of their environs.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I indeed believe that in 5 years' time, if we manage to have a better combination of the strengths of global technologies, cloud, telco, and the best of healthcare privacy and compliance as it is today, that we merge them intelligently, then there will be a real transformation of the industry. It will come from tech, but tech has also a suspicion, of ultimately monetizing maybe the data.
You mean tech doesn't have your back?
Sorry. So this combination can make a huge difference if we find the right way to do it.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to get back to something Sally said a moment ago and just get each of your brief take on it. A decade ago in these efforts in remote monitoring or in patient health record attempts that were made by Microsoft and others, the digital divide was still a really difficult thing back then. But now with the ubiquity of mobile devices and the ubiquity of connectivity, whether more or less secure, as we were talking about earlier, is there still a digital divide per se in terms of having at least a flooring of technology in terms of devices and connectivity in most parts of the U.S.? Is that something you are actively dealing with in terms of your product strategy or in terms of other policy or your efforts in, how to drive adoption and the social aspects of this?
Do you want me to start?
Oh, anyone, please, yeah.
Yeah, just real quick. So we have the answer to your question is yes. In this country and beyond, there are still parts of this country that are not connected. There are a few initiatives that we have at Microsoft that take advantage of TV white space and other things, other technologies to bring connection to people for healthcare and other things. So yeah, it is still a problem and we still need more help solving it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say it absolutely does still exist today. Although I will tell you that at AT&T, we end up spending a little more time on the digital divide that starts in the provider space between the older physicians and the younger physicians, and the divide between the younger physicians that are willing to take up new technology and the older physicians that aren't. And that can have a major impact on how quickly technology is utilized in that space. So it's a very different divide, but as impactful on the technology that we sell.
We're down to 30 seconds, Gilles.
I saw yesterday statistics that surprised me, that 50% of the seniors above 75 in the USA do not have a smartphone at home. And so I think there is still a digital divide, and I think the elderly people are probably the ones who require more this provider monitoring. So yes, there is still this divide, and I believe it will narrow down, but it's pretty significant if you think of it.
Tad, Sally, Gilles, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's been a pleasure having this discussion with you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.